You just found a forbidden pre-heresy data, Slate, in a Hive Sump. I was a man who believed in reason. I can no longer locate the precise moment I stopped. What does it mean when the last honest tool in the Imperium is a machine that should not exist? The Slate came up with the bilge on the 43rd day of the drainage cycle. I know it was the 43rd day because I had recorded each of the preceding 42 in my field notation, the way my father taught me. The way his Mechanicus-trained overseer had once taught him before the forges of Hive Tertius swallowed him whole. Precision was the only inheritance my bloodline had managed to pass intact across 3 generations of sump work. Time of retrieval, 04.17 standard. Ambient temperature of the drainage sluice, 9 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees below the seasonal mean owing to a rupture in the thermal conduit feeding sublevel Omega Nox. Effluent composition, at point of contact, polymerized hab waste, reclaimed promethium residue, trace ferrocrete particulate, and something else the assay wand could not immediately classify. Something organic and old, a reading it flagged in amber rather than red, which I noted and chose not to dwell upon. The slate itself measured approximately 30 centimeters by 20. Its casing was a dark alloy I did not recognize, neither the stamped pastel of current Administratum issue, nor the cheaper pressed synth of Hive manufactory production. It had weight to it, real weight, the kind that speaks of density rather than bulk, the kind old things possess when they have been built to outlast the ambitions of the people who made them. The surface was scored with a century of accumulated grime, but structurally undamaged. No obvious corrosion, perforations. The seams were sealed with a compound I have since identified as a cured resinous polymer of a formulation that has not been produced in this subsector for, at minimum, 400 years. The machine's spirit lock along the lower edge was active. A faint blue luminescence pulsed at 3-second intervals. Patient. Waiting. I should have logged it with the Reclamator Guild and surrendered it to the Administratum clearance intake at sublevel Primus. This is the correct procedure. I have followed correct procedure for 11 years. I am a conscientious man. My section chief, Overseer Palida Vren, has said this in my annual citations with a consistency that I have always taken as praise, and am only now beginning to understand may have been an observation about a deficiency. I did not log it. I carried it home in my equipment satchel, beneath the secondary assay wand, and the emergency respirator I have never once needed to use. I carried it 9 levels up through the service warrens, past the muttering hab shrines with their guttering candles, and their laminated picts of the God Emperor pressed flat under cracked glass, past the water reclamation station where Novus Pell was already drunk at the end of his shift, and sang something formless to himself as I passed the sealed door of my own hab unit's adjacent neighbor, behind which old Magistra Quiven has not made a sound in 11 days, and whom I have been meaning to report to the hab authority, but have not. I carried it to my table. I set it down under the lamp. I looked at it for a long time before I attempted to open it. This is where I should tell you about my life before the slate. I will do so not because the life was remarkable, but because it forms the necessary architecture against which everything that followed must be understood. I was born on this hive, Tertius Munitum, 3rd pillar of the Irontide cluster, 212 standard years since its founding charter was renewed. I was educated at the Scolum Progenium Annex on level 37, which means I received a functional literacy, a working knowledge of the Imperial Creed, and a competence in applied mechanics sufficient to pass the Reclamator Guild entrance examination on my 2nd attempt. I have worked the sump drainage system since age 19. I find, and I catalogue, and I process, and I submit. I do this 6 days in 7. On the 7th, I attend the Ministorum Chapel service on level 12, where Confessor Harl Vettring delivers his sermons in a voice like wet gravel dragged across corrugated iron, and I sit in my usual place, 3rd row from the back on the left-hand side, and I listen and I feel, on the best occasions, a warmth in the chest that I have always understood to be the presence of the God Emperor. I say I felt it. I say that in the past tense because I am being precise, and precision is my inheritance, and I will not surrender it now. I was not an unhappy man. I want to be clear about that. Happiness is perhaps too large a word for what I possessed, but there was a functional contentment, a quiet satisfaction in work, completed correctly, in readings logged accurately, in the small clean pleasure of a drainage run completed on schedule, and a field notation submitted without amendment. I knew men in the lower hive who subsisted on spite and narcotics and the residual heat of old grievances. I was not such a man. I attended chapel, I did my work, I ate my meals. I slept, generally, without significant interruption. I recorded things. I was a conscientious man. The slate opened. End the fourth attempt. The machine's spirit lock cycled through what I later identified as a 3-stage challenge response verification, the kind of system I had read about in the technical appendices of the guild certification manuals, but never encountered in operational practice because such systems belong to an older tradition of mechanicus construction than anything currently maintained in the lower hive. When the seal released, it did so with a soft exhalation, as of a long-held breath finally permitted to escape. A smell reached me, something dry and mineral and faintly metallic, not unpleasant, like the interior of a very old and very clean cabinet that has been sealed against the world for a purpose its maker considered serious. The screen illuminated, not the flat amber of standard administration displays, not the stuttering red of poorly maintained hive-issue terminals. A clear white light, steady and unwavering, resolved itself into text. The font was Lingua Technis Secondary Script, a form I had studied at the Scholam and not since had cause to use. I read it slowly, moving my lips the way my father had always disapproved of, because precision in reading, he said, meant precision in thought, and moving your lips while you read was the sign of a mind that processed slowly and imperfectly. I moved my lips. I did not care. I read the header notation, and then I read it again, and then I sat back in my chair and felt, for the first time in some years, that I could not precisely enumerate something shift inside my chest. Not the warmth of chapel, something else, something colder and more structured and more insistent, like a calibration instrument finding true north after decades of magnetic interference. The header read, Educational Commission of the Great Crusade, Iterators, Division, Field Record 14,009, compiled by Iteratores-Secundus Anselm Vaar, 3rd Exception Fleet, Classification, Unrestrict. All citizens of the Imperium of Man. All citizens of the Imperium of Man are entitled to access and reproduce this record in the service of human understanding. I read it 3 more times. Then I began to understand why it had been buried. Iteratores-Secundus Anselm Vaar had a voice in text. This is a rare thing. Most official documentation has no voice at all. It is language serving administrative function. Words as bureaucratic mechanism, the medium of government, communicating in a tone designed to establish authority rather than convey meaning. But Vaar wrote the way a man speaks when he believes he has something urgent to say and is confident the person he is saying it to is capable of receiving it. He used the second person sparingly and with precision. He used technical language where it was warranted and set it aside when it would have obscured Ra. There, then illuminated. He moved between the observation and the implication without the cautious, hedging pauses of a man writing for an audience. He does not trust. I read through the night. I did not sleep. I made a cup of recaf at some point and did not drink it. I found it cold at my elbow when the Hab unit's environmental system cycled to morning light at 06.00. I ate nothing. I recorded in my field notation, which I had brought to the table out of habit, and which now struck me as both inadequate and essential, the timestamp of every significant passage, the page reference, the precise lingua technis rendering, and beside it, in my own handwriting, a translation into the Low Gothic I had been taught, which I was beginning to suspect was itself a diminished instrument, a language reduced, a vocabulary pruned of precision, a grammar stripped of the registers necessary to carry certain classes of thought. Vaar had written the field record across 4 years of the Crusade's advance into what is now the Irontide cluster. He had accompanied the expedition fleet as an official documentarian, a keeper of record, which, in the early Crusade period, meant something the Iteratores division took seriously enough to train its practitioners in historiography, philosophy, epistemology, and the principles of evidence-based inquiry. He had documented the initial contact with the proto-hive, settlements then occupying this world. He had recorded their social structures, their surviving technical knowledge, their oral traditions, their attempts to maintain the fragments of a technological culture across the darkness between the Age of Strife and the Crusade's arrival. He had done this with the meticulous care of a man who understood that what he was recording was irreplaceable, that the subjects of his documentation were unique specimens of human cultural adaptation in isolation, that whatever the expedition fleet brought with it would irrevocably alter, and in many cases obliterate what had existed before, and that the least he could do in the service of human understanding was get it right. He had also, in the final section of the record, written something else entirely. The final section was dated 3 years after the main body of the record. It was written in the same clear, precise hand, but the lingua technis rendering carried what I can only describe, with apologies for the imprecision, as a quality of weight, not sadness exactly, not anger, something that I kept reaching for a word to describe, and finding that the Low Gothic available to me did not contain the right instrument. I eventually settled for grief with clarity intact. He wrote about what was being lost, not in the abstract, specifically, with timestamps and referenced documentation, and cited examples that I checked, cross-referencing where I could against the fragments of history available in the Guild Certification Library, and found to be accurate as far as the records I had access to could confirm. He wrote about the Remembrancers and their dissolution. He wrote about the philosophical academies of the Crusades' early decades, the open debates conducted between Remembrancers and officers and Iteratores about the nature of history and the proper relationship between a unified species and its recorded past, and the specific, datable moment at which those debates ceased to be conducted openly and became instead a thing conducted in private, in whispers, in letters encoded and carried by hand, rather than transmitted through official channels. He wrote about the Lectatio Divinitatis and what it was doing to the populations he had documented in this cluster, how the proto-hive settlements had maintained their own fragmentary but functional relationship with secular reason, with evidence-based practice, with the understanding that the universe operated according to principles that could be observed and recorded and communicated, and how that relationship was now being dismantled, layer by layer, replaced with a catechism of dependence and submission and the absolute authority of the divine. He wrote, "The people of this world maintained, across 400 years of isolation and deprivation and the constant psychological pressure of darkness, a working understanding that the universe is knowable. They did not know everything. They knew almost nothing compared to what the Crusade carried with it. But they knew how to know. They understood the principle of inquiry. They understood that a question deserved an answer founded in evidence rather than revelation. They understood that this principle was worth preserving across generations, even in conditions barely compatible with survival. Because a species that knows how to know is a species that cannot be permanently extinguished. I have watched this understanding be replaced in the space of a single generation by a doctrine of divine incomprehensibility, and I have watched the faces of the people as it happened, and what I have seen there is not the peace of the converted. It is the relief of the no longer responsible. This is the thing I am afraid of. Not the doctrine. The relief. I put the slate down. I looked at the cold recaf. I looked at my field notation, filled now with my careful, precise, transcribed translations. I looked at the Hab unit around me, the shelf with the 7 approved texts of the Imperial Creed, the laminated pict of the God Emperor in the pose of the Allfather, the small devotional candle with 3 months of fresh burn time that I refreshed dutifully at the start, of each month. I looked at all of it, and I tried to locate, in the place in my chest where the warmth usually was, the warmth. I found something, but it was not what I had previously thought it was. I sat with this discovery for a long time before I could assign it a classification. I am trained in classification. I was not rushing. What I found, when I examined it with precision, was habit. I went to work on the 44th day. I ran the drainage cycle. I logged the readings. The ambient temperature in the sluice was 8.4 degrees Celsius. Which was 0.4 degrees below the previous day's reading and consistent with the ongoing thermal conduit rupture I had already noted in the maintenance request that had been submitted to the Guild Infrastructure Division and had not yet been acknowledged. The effluent composition was within standard parameters. I found 3 items of reclamator-grade interest: a partial power cell casing, a length of conductive wire, and a section of what appeared to be a ceiling support strut from a Habe collapse in the adjacent sublevel. I logged all 3. I submitted the notation. Overseer Polida Vren reviewed my submission at 14.00 standard, as she did every 44th day when her duty rotation aligned with mine. She is a tall woman of middle age with a face that has been comprehensively weathered by a career in the sublevels and eyes that serve things with an efficiency I have always admired and am now finding, for reasons I am still in the process of articulating, faintly troubling. She noted that my notation for the thermal conduit request had been submitted 4 days ago without response and offered to escalate. I thanked her. She initiated the escalation request. I watched her fill out the appropriate form in the appropriate fields with the appropriate terminology, and I thought about Iteratores-Secundus Anselm Vaar writing about the relief of the no longer responsible, and I looked away. "You seem tired," she said, not looking up from the form. "I slept poorly," I said. This was accurate. The confessor's speaking at evening service. The late one, not the early. Veteran does a good evening sermon, I find, better than the morning ones. He's more awake. She sealed the form and handed it to the servitor runner for transmission. Helps with sleep, in my experience. Settles things down. "I may attend," I said. This was inaccurate. I did not attend. I went home and read the slate for the 2nd time. In the 11 days that followed, I developed a practice. I am a man of practice. Practice is how I have always structured my relationship with the things I consider important. I read the slate in the evenings, always at the table, always with the lamp at the same angle, always with my field notation, open B. Side it, though I had ceased to use the notation for transcription and was now using it for something more difficult to name. I was not transcribing. I was thinking. I was following an argument and marking the places where the argument required me to revise something I had previously held to be settled. There were more of these places than I had anticipated. I had not anticipated many. I had not known I had so many things I held to be settled. On the 5th evening, I found a passage I have since thought about, with a frequency I find, on reflection, diagnostic. Vaar was writing about the early Crusades' relationship with what he called, without apparent self-consciousness, the human inheritance of reason. He wrote, "We carry with us, in the gene pattern of the species, the capacity for systematic inquiry. It did not arrive fully formed. It was developed across millennia at enormous cost, against the constant resistance of every psychological tendency that makes sustained critical thought uncomfortable. The capacity to ask a question and wait for evidence before forming a conclusion, rather than accepting the first comforting answer, is not natural. It is an achievement. It is a civilizational achievement of the same order as the development of language or the wheel, and it is exactly as fragile, and it is possible to lose it, and we have lost it before, and we are in the process of losing it again, and I am documenting this, not because I believe the documentation will prevent the loss, but because I believe that understanding what is lost is the first condition of any eventual recovery. I read this and then I sat still for a long time. Outside, through the ventilation grill, the hive spoke its constant language. Machinery, distant voices, the percussive rhythm of the recycling, presses on the level below, the muted devotional chant from the Hab shrine 2 units down the corridor. I listened to all of it with a new attention, the way you listen to something familiar when you have just been given a reason to hear it differently. The chant was from the Lamentations of St. Braxus Unwell, a standard devotional text I had known since childhood. I listened to the words. I had never, I realized, listened to the words. I had listened to the rhythm, the familiar cadence, the warmth of the heard thing, the comfort of the known pattern. The words themselves, I now listened to them as meaning-bearing units. What they said when examined was this: do not think. Trust the light. The light will think for you. The light has already thought for you. Your thought is not needed and is in fact dangerous. Rest in the light. Rest in the light. Rest in the light. I noted in my field notation, with the timestamp 22.47 standard, the following observation. The hymn is not instructing devotion, it is instructing the cessation of enquiry. I had always understood these to be the same thing. I went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time. This is the correct word, though I was aware, as I pursued it, of how inadequate the resources available to me were for the task. The Guild Certification Library is functional for what it was designed to support. Technical manuals, procedural frameworks, maintenance schedules, and approved historical summaries of the kind that convey dates and names and the correct approved interpretation of those dates and names. It does not contain primary sources. It contains summaries of approved conclusions. I understood this in a general way before. I understand it now with a specificity that I find it difficult to set aside. I requested access to the Administratum Secondary Archive on level 42. This required a written application, a stated purpose, 2 countersignatures from Guild-certified personnel of at least journeyman grade, and the approval of an Administratum archivist. The stated purpose I provided was historical research pertaining to pre-settlement, geological and environmental conditions of the hive substrate, relevant to ongoing drainage assessment and maintenance planning. This was technically accurate in the sense that the hive's substrate history was among the topics I wanted to investigate, and technically misleading in every other respect. The application was approved in 6 days. Overseer Vren countersigned without comment. I thanked her. She told me not to lose her stylus again. The secondary archive was smaller than I had expected. Larger archives exist, I know, in the upper hive's Administratum complex, in the sealed levels of the Mechanicus Annex, and in the orbital platform that services the cluster's administrative coordination. What was available to me was a room containing 342 indexed cabinets of physical documentation, 12 accessible documentation, 12 accessible documentation, 12 accessible documentation, archive software, and an archivist, Subsensor Yenna Brawl, who watched me with the particular quality of attention that archive functionaries develop after years of managing access to things that someone, at some point, has decided require careful management. I spent 11 days in the archive. I went before my duty shift, using the 4 hours between end of sleep cycle. and beginning of drainage rotation. I took my field notation. I wore my guild certification badge and my most professionally maintained oversuit, and I was, I believe, the model of a conscientious lower-hive worker conducting legitimate research. Sub-Sensor Brawl watched me work and occasionally brought me documentation I had requested, and occasionally denied request. Wests with a formulaic courtesy that told me nothing about whether the denial was administrative or deliberate. I noted each denial in my field notation with the timestamp and the stated reason, which was in every case the same. Requested material classified, access requires higher clearance designation. I found, in what was available, fragments, partial records, administrative correspondence with substantial redactions, the redacted sections blacked out with a thoroughness that suggested the person or system doing the blacking out was aware that context alone could sometimes reconstitute meaning. The kind of record that has been pruned rather than preserved, the historical equivalent of a drainage run that has been carefully cleaned of everything interesting before inspection. But fragments are not nothing. Fragments, examined with precision, can be diagnostic. I was trained in this. The sump gives up partial things, corroded, incomplete, contaminated, and you learn to read them with their gaps present rather than filled, to make allowances for what is missing without pretending the missing material is not there. What I found in the fragments confirmed, at the level of documentary evidence, the Ark Vaar had described. The early settlement records, the few that survived uncensored, showed a community that asked questions about its world in ways that the later records did not. Maintenance queries that investigated root causes rather than applying approved remediation procedures. Agricultural adjustments based on soil testing and observed outcomes rather than Ministorum-approved planting calendars. Medical practices that distinguished between effective treatments and ineffective ones on the basis of patient outcomes rather than doctrinal sanction. The later records, from approximately 200 years after initial Crusade contact, showed a community that had learned to ask a different kind of question. Not, what is happening and why, and what does the evidence suggest we do about it, but, what is the approved response to this category of event, and have the proper devotional observances been performed, and has the matter been referred to the appropriate ecclesiastical authority? The questions are not the same. The questions are not even close to the same. They are oriented toward different objects entirely. One toward the world, one toward the approval of those with the authority to grant or withhold it. I noted this in my field notation. I noted the timestamps. I noted the specific documentary references. I noted that I was in the archive's silent reading room, in the presence of a pattern I recognized, and that recognizing it required me to apply it not only to the historical record, but to the present one, which included myself, and that doing so was, as the technical manuals say of certain categories of diagnostic finding, significant. Finding. Significant. Which meant I arrived before the main congregation and sat in my usual place and watched the chapel fill around me with the familiar faces of the Level 12 devotional community, the water reclamation workers in their orange overalls, the HAB maintenance teams, the school children brought in crocodile formation by their Scolum Progenium instructors, the elderly, the infirm, the dutiful, the habitual, and among them, here and there, the genuine. I can distinguish the genuine. I have sat among them for years, and I know what it looks like when someone is not going through emotion, but rather arriving at something real. I know what it looks like because I believed, until recently, that I was among them. Confessor Harl Vettring delivered his sermon. The subject was the grace of unknowing, the Emperor's wisdom, he said, was beyond the comprehension of mortal minds, and this was not a limitation to be mourned, but a gift to be received, because the mind that acknowledged its own incapacity was the mind freed from the burden of enquiry, freed from the terrible weight of the need to understand, freed to simply trust, he said. The Emperor does not ask you to comprehend, he asks you to obey. And in your obedience, you will find the only peace this world can offer. I noted, in the field notation I had brought and was holding in my lap in the way I usually hold the creed text, the incense in the chapel censer contained 0.7 milligrams of Kellyan root per cubic meter of enclosed air. I had taken a small sample the previous week and run it through the assay wand at home out of a quality of attention I was not, at that point, fully able to explain to myself. A concentration of 0.7 milligrams of Kellyan root per cubic meter is below the threshold of hallucinogenic effect, but within the range associated with mild euphoria, reduced critical cognitive function, and increased susceptibility to suggestion. This has been documented in the Guild's occupational safety materials as a hazard to be monitored in certain industrial environments. I had read those materials. I had passed the examination on them. I had not, until 19 days ago, thought to apply them here. I looked at the faces of the congregation. I looked at the quality of peace on them. I looked at the children in the third row, who had been brought here by their instructors and who were sitting with the slightly dazed expression of young minds still porous enough to absorb whatever environment they were placed in. I looked at the confessor, his wet gravel voice, his complete conviction, absolute absence in his face of anything resembling doubt, which I had previously read as faith, and was now reading as a different thing, a thing whose name I was still in the process of settling. The warmth that I had always felt here. I monitored it. I monitored it with the same precision I brought to a drainage reading. What I found was that the warmth was present. It was real. The chapel was warm in temperature, 18 degrees, 4 degrees above the corridor outside. The incense was present. The familiar cadences of the liturgy were present. Patterns my nervous system had been trained to associate with safety and belonging over the course of 31 years. The warmth was a response to the environment. I was not experiencing something outside myself encountering me. I was experiencing my own nervous systems, doing what nervous systems do. Pattern matching to the familiar, releasing the relevant neurochemical response, interpreting that response as contact with the divine. I noted this. I noted it without particular emotion, which I also noted. I noted the absence of distress. I noted that the absence of distress was itself. I noted that the absence of distress was itself interesting. A man who had just discovered that the central spiritual practice of his life was a neurochemical response to environmental conditioning should perhaps feel something more significant than the quality of calm attention I was currently experiencing. I sat with this for the remainder of the service. I filed out with the congregation. I exchanged the standard brief devotional acknowledgements with the 3 or 4 faces I could put names to. I went to work. I ran the drainage cycle. The thermal conduit was still ruptured. The temperature in the sluice was 8.1 degrees. I noted everything. I felt very little. Merry old Mary, I returned to the archive. Sub-Sensor Brohl had begun to look at me with a quality of attention I recognized as the administrative precursor to an enquiry, the look of someone who has been watching a pattern and has reached the point of needing to do something about it. I was aware of this and considered it, and continued my research, because the alternative was to stop, and I found that I could not. What I was doing, I understood by this point, was an autopsy, not of the historical record of myself. The historical record was the context and the instrument. The subject was the man sitting in the reading room, with the field notation, and the careful handwriting, and the growing, quiet, completely undistressed awareness that something essential had departed, and that he was in the process of mapping the exact contours of its absence. Vaar had written, "The documentation of a loss is not the same as the loss itself. The loss happens in the world in time, in the bodies and minds of specific people in specific places making specific choices. The documentation is the attempt to hold the shape of the lost thing in the record so that some future reader who encounters the shape can recognize it, can understand what filled it once, can understand what the world was like when that shape was occupied. He had added, in what I recognized as a later insertion, the ink slightly different in quality, the pressure slightly heavier. I am writing this for you. I do not know your name. I know you are there, somewhere in the future of this documentation, because the future always contains readers the present cannot see. I am writing this because I want you to know what it was like when we still asked questions, when we still believed the asking was the point, not the answer. When we still understood that a species capable of uncertainty is a species capable of growth, and that the certainty being offered in exchange for that uncertainty is not a gift but a cage. The certainty being offered in exchange for that uncertainty is not a gift but a cage. I sat with this for, according to my notation, 43 minutes. The archive was quiet. Sub-Sensor Brohl was processing incoming documentation at her desk, with the small mechanical sounds of a person engaged in a repetitive task they have long since ceased to think about. A servitor hummed somewhere behind the cabinet rows. The data terminal beside me showed the result of the search I had performed before opening the slate, a query into the historical record of the Iterators division. The department Vaar had served, its mandate, and its eventual dissolution. The result was 17 words, which I had read twice and copied into my notation. The Iterators division was absorbed into the Ministerium Doctrinal Commission. In M31, all Iterators records were reclassified. No further information is available. No further information is available. I noted this. I noted, beside it, in my own shorthand, all records reclassified. No further information. The information exists. It has been put somewhere the further cannot reach. And a man who knows how to know, and knows where the gap is standing at the edge of it. On the 28th day I stopped going to chapel. I noticed this not with any particular decision, but as a fact of my schedule. The time I had previously allocated to the morning service I began allocating to the archive research. Overseer Vren mentioned, during a routine citation review, that she had not seen me at the level 12 services recently. I told her I had been attending the later service at level 20, which is also available, and which she accepted without pressing further. I noted, in my field notation, that I had lied to my section chief for the second time. I noted that the lie was easy. I noted that the lie was easy. I noted there. The ease was itself a reading. I need to tell you about the day I found the lower stack. The archive's primary collection occupied the 342 indexed cabinets I had identified at the outset. There was a lower stack, accessed through a gated door beside the maintenance passage, that Sub-Sensor Brohl had told me, on my first day, was restricted to Administratum secondary, grade access and above. I was Guild Journeyman grade, which was not the same thing. I was aware of this. I had been aware of it each of the 29 days I had spent in the archive, aware the way you are aware of a locked door, when you are not sure whether you want to open it badly enough to incur the consequences of trying. On the 30th day I came in before Sub-Sensor Brohl arrived for her shift. The archive opens at 05.00, and Brohl's shift begins at 06.00. I had the access code for the main archive, because it had been provided to me as part of my approved access. The lower stack's gate lock was a standard Administratum model of a type I had encountered before in my sump work, where Administratum substations control access to some of the drainage infrastructure. I had replaced 5 of this model of lock in the past 3 years, and replacement requires understanding the mechanism. I am a conscientious man. I am also a precise one. I note this not as an excuse but as an explanation of what happened next, which is that I was inside the lower stack and had sealed the gate behind me at 05.14 standard. The lower stack was colder than the main archive by 4 degrees Celsius. The documentation stored there was of a different character. Not the standard Administratum formatted record with its uniform fonts and its approved terminology, but older materials, pre-standardization materials, the kind of documentation that predates the current archival framework. Physical documents, some of them, not data slates. Not printed on Administratum-grade material, but on something heavier and more durable. A synthetic parchment of the kind I had read about in the Guild's material history texts as a pre-standardization production format. I did not have time for a thorough investigation. I estimated, 50 minutes before Brawl's shift began, and the risk of detection became acute. I used those 50 minutes with as much precision as the circumstances permitted, moving along the cabinet rows, reading the index tags, identifying the materials most directly relevant to the thread I had been following, extracting and photographing with the small image capture device I had reposed from a piece of standard sump inspection equipment. I photographed 47 documents. I replaced each one exactly as I had found it. I left the lower stack at 05.59. Subsensor, Broer. Low arrived at 06.03. 3 minutes late, and found me at my usual terminal, conducting an apparently routine search of the approved archive index. Early start, she said. The drainage run finishes before shift, I said. This was true. She made recaf. She offered me a cup. I accepted it. It was better than the recaf I make at home, which I noted and did not comment on. We sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have spent enough hours in the same room to be at ease in each other's presence, and I thought about the 47 photographs on the image capture device in my oversuit pocket, and I thought about what I had seen in the brief passes I had made through the lower stack, the indexed labels on the cabinets I had not had time to open, the categories of material they described, and I thought, I am a man who has just stolen. I am a man who has lied twice and stolen once. I am a man who, 1 month ago, attended chapel without examination and recorded his drainage readings without question, and was, in all externally measurable respects, an entirely conscientious and detemberland, unremarkable person. Something essential is leaving me. This thought arrived not as a fear, but as a diagnosis. Something essential is leaving. The question is whether what is leaving is the thing worth keeping. The photographs yielded 3 significant findings. I will record them with precision, which is what I have. First, a partial copy of an administrative memorandum, undated but bearing the letterhead of the Great Crusade's Compliance Division, addressed to the First Settlement Authority of what was then being called Yorentide III, and would eventually become Hive Tertius Munitum. The memorandum established the initial framework for the settlement's administrative and doctrinal organization. It was 14 pages long. Pages 1 through 9 were present. Pages 10 through 14 were absent, their absence marked by a clean cut at the binding that suggested removal rather than deterioration. The 9 present pages established a general framework, administrative structure, census procedures, resource allocation, and the basic outline of the educational program to be implemented, which the memorandum described as consistent with the principles of secular rational administration, as outlined in the Crusade's founding charter, with particular emphasis on evidence-based reasoning, systematic inquiry, and the cultivation of critical cognitive faculties as the foundation of a productive and self-determining citizenry. I read this 3 times. I noted it with the timestamp. I noted the phrase self-determining. I noted the phrase evidence-based reasoning. I noted that these phrases in this context, from this source, meant something about what kind of people the early Crusades administration believed it was trying to create, and that the people I had grown up among, the people of the lower hive, were not those people, were not close to those people, and that the distance between what was intended and what existed was not the result of failure, but of decision. Second, a partial census record from what the document identified as year 43 of the settlement, which by my calculation fell approximately 160 years before the current date. The census included, unusually, a section on educational attainment and literacy. The literacy rate recorded in year 43 for the adult population of the lower settlement levels, 72%, functional literacy in lingua, technis primary and secondary, with an additional 31% showing advanced competency in at least one specialist technical domain. I found, in the approved archive, a census from 100 years later, which I had already noted for its literacy statistics. Adult functional literacy in lingua, technis primary, 28%, secondary lingua, technis, 3%, specialist technical domain competency, 11%. I sat with these numbers for a long time. They were not surprising. This was the thing that I could not settle. They were not surprising. I had enough fragments at this point to have expected this, but expectation, I was finding, does not prevent the weight of the confirmed thing from settling on you. I noted the numbers. I noted the weight. Third, and this is the thing I will say last, because I have been approaching it throughout this testimony and have not yet found the precise way to set it down. Among the photographs, I had captured an image of what appeared to be a personal letter, handwritten, unsigned, folded, and then sealed in a translucent archival preservation sleeve of the kind used for documents considered significant. The letter was addressed to no one. It began, "If you are reading this, you found a way to reach the lower stack, which means you are someone the system failed to fully absorb, which means there are still such people, which is the only useful thing I can tell you. The rest is just the record of a man who watched a civilization being built out of the wrong materials and understood, too late, what that meant for the people who would have to live inside it." The letter ran to 7 pages. I have read it 42 times since. It was written by someone who identified themselves only by profession, an archivist, a keeper of records, someone who had worked in this archive since, they said, before the standardization, meaning before the current framework, meaning they had been present for the transition. They described what they had observed over a working life, spent in proximity to the documents that recorded what the settlement had been and what it was becoming. They described the specific categories of document that were removed from general access and placed in the lower stack, and before the lower stack existed, destroyed. They described the internal logic of the removal, not malice, they wrote, or not only malice, but a coherent administrative philosophy, a consistent view of what kind of population was most useful and most stable. And the answer being, a population that asked the right questions, which meant the questions that had the right answers, which meant the questions whose answers had been pre-approved. The letter described this as the substitution of a frame, not the removal of everything inside it. You keep the questions, they wrote. You just change what they're allowed to point at. Near the end of the letter, the archivist wrote something I have been carrying since I read it, in the way you carry a stone in your pock. Feeling its weight, with every step, they wrote. I used to believe that keeping the record was enough, that the preservation of the documentation was itself a form of resistance, that as long as the evidence existed somewhere, the possibility of return existed. I no longer believe this. The record is not nothing, but a record read by no one is a voice speaking in a sealed room. What I think now is that the record must reach someone who knows what it says, someone who has enough left intact to hear it. I do not know if you are that person. I do not know if I was. But I am leaving this here because the alternative is to not leave it, and I cannot make myself not leave it. I sat in my hab unit, and I held the image capture device, and I read those words in the reproduction of that handwriting, and I felt something move through me that I will, in the interest of precision, describe as a current. The way an electrical current moves through a conductive medium, not originating in the medium, but using it, traveling through it from source to destination. I felt it move through me, and I felt simultaneously its passage and its absence. I felt it arrive, and I felt it go, and when it had gone, what remained was very quiet, very still. I noted the time. I noted the quality of the stillness. I noted that I was not, any longer, entirely the person who had found the slate in the sump 3 days ago. I noted that I was not the person who had sat in the third row from the back, on the left-hand side of the level 12 chapel, and felt the warmth that he had always thought was the Emperor's hand. I noted that the person I was becoming did not yet have a complete shape, and that the incompleteness was neither comfortable nor unbearable, but was rather the condition that the archivist's letter and Vaar's field record and all the fragments in between had been describing, the condition of a mind in the process of becoming responsible for itself, again which is not peaceful, for itself, again which is not peaceful, which is not the relief of the no longer responsible, but which is, when examined with precision, the only condition in which certain categories of thought can occur. I will tell you what happened after. Not as confession, because I am not confessing to anything, but as record, because the record is what we have, and the record must reach someone who knows what it says. I went back to the drainage cycle. I ran the 44th day, and the 44th day, and the 45th, and the 63rd, and the 101st. I recorded my readings with the same precision I had always brought to them, and the precision felt different now. Not more or less precise, in fact, but different in quality, the way a familiar tool feels different when you understand it as an instrument rather than a habit. I found things in the sump. I catalogued them. I submitted my notations. The thermal conduit was repaired on day 61 by a maintenance team who had presumably received the escalated request that Overseer Wren had submitted on my behalf, though the acknowledgement had never arrived. I continued my research. Not in the archive, because I had with reasonable certainty extracted from the available material everything that would be accessible to me there, and because Subsensor Brohl's quality of attention had reached the point of administrative action that I expected would eventually involve a review of my access and the possible discovery of my visit to the lower stack, which I preferred to delay for as long as the delay remained useful. I conducted research in the Hab unit, using the slate and the photographed materials, and the fragments from the guild library and the 47 images from the lower stack, building, across the weeks that followed, the most complete picture I could assemble. I did not attend chapel. I noted the absence of the warmth I had previously felt there, and I noted that the absence did not trouble me, as I had, in the early weeks, expected it might. The warmth had been real in the sense that it was a genuine response, but it had not been what I thought it was, and knowing what it was did not make it available to me as what I had thought it was. You cannot unknow a thing. This is both the tragedy and the utility of knowing things. I converted the slate's documentation. I translated the significant sections from the Lingua Technis secondary script into Low Gothic with as much fidelity as the Low Gothic would permit, noting in each case where a concept had resisted translation because the conceptual vocabulary was absent from the available language, and noting those gaps as gaps, rather than filling them with approximations that would have smoothed them over and lost the shape of what was missing. I made copies, physical copies, written by hand in the archival preservation format I had studied in the Guild material history texts. 3 copies. Each one complete. Each one accurate. I will not describe where I placed those copies. I will say only that I chose 3 locations based on the principle that distributed preservation is more durable than concentrated preservation, a principle that Vaar had articulated in his field record, and that the history of what had happened to the archive's lower stack had confirmed. I placed them where a conscientious person with the right instruments and a quality of attention the system had not fully managed to extinguish might, in some future that I cannot see, encounter them. I went to the drainage cycle. I recorded my readings. The sump, on the 131st day, yielded a corroded datatear. Mineral housing, a section of what appeared to be pre-settlement architectural detail, and 3 items of standard reclamator grade interest that I logged and submitted. The terminal housing went to the guild clearance intake. The architectural detail I tagged for Administratum Antiquities review, a process that I knew would take months and might result in the item being registered or absorbed without meaningful examination, but which I followed because the correct procedure for the correct category of found item is the correct procedure, and procedure has value even when you have ceased to confuse it with the thing the procedure was designed to serve. I am writing this as a record. I am writing it in the notation that has been my inheritance, my instrument, my practice. I am a man who is more awake than he was, which means he is a man who is more alone than he was, which is the price of the thing, and which I note, without objection. The price is the price. The instrument is the instrument. What Vaar wrote for me, without knowing me across however many centuries of sealed darkness, was this: the capacity to ask a question and wait for evidence before forming a conclusion is not natural. It is an achievement. It is fragile. It can be lost, and understanding what was lost is the first condition of any eventual recovery. I was a man who believed the warmth in his chest was the hand of a god. Now I know it was the hand of a man who understood neurochemistry and architectural acoustics and the specific psychological vulnerabilities of people who have been told all their lives that understanding is dangerous. What is a guardian who no longer believes in what he guards? Perhaps he is no longer a guardian. Perhaps he is, at last, a keeper of something worth keeping. The warmth is gone. What remains is colder and more precise, and entirely my own, and I will carry it through the drainage cycles and the notation, reviews, and the long evenings at the table with the lamp at the correct angle, and I will record it accurately, and I will leave it where someone who knows how to look might eventually find it. The machine spirit of Iteratores-Secundus Anselm Vaar's data slate has ceased to pulse. I noted the time, 03:44 standard. The amber light went last. The screen is dark now. The battery has finally concluded its long patience. But I have what it carried. I have it in my notation, and in my copies, and in the part of my cognition that has been permanently restructured by the encounter, the way that any genuine calibration permanently adjusts the instrument that conducts it. The slate is dark, and I am awake. That is the complete record. Field notation entry 999, 1998. Drainage section Omega Nox, sublevel Delta, Hive Tertius Munitum, Iontide cluster. Submitted standard date withheld at author's discretion. Notation archived per standard guild protocol. Category Gamma. Subclassification. Observations of potential administrative significance. Reviewer action pending. The author's name has been omitted from this document. The author notes that omission is not the same as absence.